Hello, families. So this is the first lesson in the unit called Accentuate the Negative. This is where we learn how the operations work with integers, which includes all whole numbers, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Integers do not include fractional values, so like 1.5 wouldn't be an integer. But anyway, that's number classification, and integers are defined by all positive whole numbers and their opposites. So I really didn't need to say positive because all whole numbers are positive, but all the whole numbers and their opposites. And opposites in this context means basically the negative version of a positive whole number or of a whole number, or the positive version or the whole number, which correlates to a negative number. For example, -5, its opposite would be +5. 15, its opposite would be -15. 27, its opposite would be -27. And -50, its opposite would be 50. So if you were to imagine the number line going from 0 to infinity, showing just the whole numbers, and a mirror image of that number line to the left of 0, you could fold that number line over and the numbers would match up. So 10 on the right side, +10, would match up with -10 on the left. Those would be opposites. So that's one definition of integers. And in this unit, we're going to figure out what it means to add, multiply, subtract, and divide integers. So what does negative do to our world of mathematics? So in order to get that, what do negatives do? In order to get that started, we get introduced to this game called Math Fever. Here's the context of the story. Basically, teams are playing a game where if they score an answer correct, they increase the number of points that they have. However, if they score or they answer a question incorrect, they actually score negative points. And it is possible in this game to go below 0. So if a team has 0 points and they get a 150 point question incorrect, they will end up in the hole 150 points. All right. So that's a quick explanation of the story. And then we get asked our very first question. And our very first question, let's see as it loads up. We are asked which team has the highest score and which team has the lowest score. Explain how you decided. So here I'm going to bring this explanation over. This program behaves a little bit more different for me than it does, or a little bit different for me than it does for students. Oh, there's that darn misspelling. Let me go ahead and fix that. Okay, there we go. So rocket scientists have the highest score because they're the only ones with a positive score. They're the only ones that are above 0 in the number of points. And every positive integer is larger than every negative integer. So there's no positive integer that could possibly be less than a -1. So in this case, rocket scientists, being the only ones with a positive score, are in the lead. Know-it-alls are the ones that have the lowest score. They're the ones furthest away from being positive. So they're the ones that are most negative. They have lost the most amount of points by answering the most amount of questions incorrectly. So they are the most negative. And I'm using that language very specifically. So just kind of keep that in mind as we move forward. They are the most negative. All right. So that's the answer to that question. And here in question 2, we're going to be asked to write number sentences, or actually write number sentences in number 3, and then find the difference for each pair of teams. So for each pair of teams, we're going to compare super brains to rocket scientists, super brains to know-it-alls. Rocket scientists, I'm going to kind of go the extra mile and compare it to super brains and know-it-alls, even though we already compared these two. And then for know-it-alls, I'm going to compare it to super brains and rocket scientists. So when we make that comparison, we start figuring out the relative distance that these teams are away from each other. And what that means is just like finding differences before integers, is basically we're subtracting the points. We're going to see that later. Right now, your students don't have a method to evaluate that subtraction, so we're just going to we're going to walk the points out between the teams. Excuse me. You'll see what I mean here. So super brains are 450 points behind rocket scientists. So super brains here, we have to imagine that they started at 0 and they lost 300 points. So they're behind 300. And even if they got back to 0, they would need an additional 150 points to catch up to rocket scientists. So it would take 300 points to get to 0 and, so addition, 150 points to catch up to rocket scientists. Therefore, if we were to subtract these two values, we end up with 450 points of difference between them. Super brains are 250 points ahead of know-it-alls. So you can see that know-it-alls, if they were both at negative 300 points and know-it-alls got a question wrong that was worth 200, they would be behind super brains 200 points. Or if they were both at negative 500, super brains got a 200-point question correct, then they would, end up at negative 300. So 200 points closer to 0 than know-it-alls. Therefore, they're 200 points ahead. Rocket scientists are 450 points. We already established that, but this time rocket scientists are 450 points ahead of super brains, and they are 650 points ahead of know-it-alls. Know-it-alls are 200 points behind super brains, and they are 650 points behind rocket scientists. I'm sorry for the misspelling there. Now we're asked to write number sentences for this. Now here's where things get a little complicated for students. First time we've been asked to write number sentences for integers. So here we go. Let's give it a shot. So two possible ways that each team reached this score. I'm going to give you one. Your student's going to need to come up with another one. So super brains could have gotten two 150-point questions wrong. So they started off at 0, then they lost 150 points, and then lost another 150 points. That would put them at negative 300. Rocket scientists could have gotten a 50-point question correct, and then a 100-point question correct, giving them a score of 150. Know-it-alls, they could have just had a really bad time and got a 50-point question correct, another 50-point question correct. That puts them at negative 100. 100-point question incorrect. Incorrect for all of these. That puts them at negative 200. Another 50-point question incorrect. That's negative 250. And then they try to get back to even, but unfortunately answered incorrect and lost another 250 points, putting them at negative 500. So the number sentence is going to include a lot of subtraction there. We're going to learn later that if we're combining point values, it might make more sense to combine point values and assign those values as either positive or negative with a symbol in front of the number, but combine them always using addition. We're going to see what that looks like, I believe, in the last question. So here we are asked to start off with a new set of point values, or these are the point values from before. They just reminded us of them. And a series of 4 questions for each of the teams, and we're asked to put together a number sentence and figure out what their score is now after answering these questions. So we have to see that the correct answer, we're going to be adding value, and the incorrect answer, we're going to be subtracting value, okay, or going more negative. So super brains, I almost missed this, by the way, so you want to look up here in the preface to the question, the setup. And we have negative 300 for super brains. So we start off our number sentence with negative 300. Then we go up by 200 points, down by 150 points, up by 50 points because it's a correct answer, up again by 50 points, and we end up at negative 150 points. So we started out pretty low, started catching up. Now we're at negative 100 points. Unfortunately, we lost 150 points, so now we're at negative 250. We gained 50 back, so we're at negative 200. gained another 50, so now we're at negative 150. So that's the logic behind that number sentence. I'll let you go ahead and evaluate the other two, but those would be the correct number sentences for both of those. Let me see if I can get the font size a little bit bigger for the video. And, yep. That way your student can copy it down for themselves. Again, if your student's doing this online, fantastic. If they have to do it on paper, that's fine too. Absolutely fine. So I'm just looking for students to get the content. Again, accentuate the negative is going to be done completely, or delivered, excuse me, completely online via video. Now, we saw in the points that superbrains and rocket scientists both wound up at negative 150 points. So that takes us to this question, where we are asked, at this point in the game, which team has the highest score? Well, two teams are tied. So they both have the highest score, and the highest score, I started using some abbreviations here. KIA, know-it-alls, RS, rocket scientists, and SB for superbrains. So superbrains tied with rocket scientists, is tied with rocket scientists, and is 450 points ahead of know-it-alls. So they're at negative 150, if you remember from the last question. And know-it-alls wound up at negative 600. So in order for know-it-alls to catch up, they would have to gain 450 points. So that means rocket scientists and superbrains are 450 points ahead of know-it-alls. So the same is true for rocket scientists, and then know-it-alls is 450 points behind superbrains and rocket scientists. So notice that the point value is describing a distance, and either behind or ahead is describing a direction. That's going to be important later. And of course, reviewed several times. So we have a distance and a direction. So we're asked to find the difference in points for each pair of teams. Superbrains and rocket scientists have find the difference in points for each set of teams. I think, I messed up my answer order here. So we found the difference in points here. And the answer to the first question, I'm sorry about that, is superbrains and rocket scientists are tied for the lead, and know-it-alls have the lowest score. Here is the difference in points for each pair of teams. Sorry for that. Wish this loaded a little bit faster, but here we go. So now we need to find the answers to a couple of these number sentences here. So here, my explanation, so the answer is going to be negative 150 points. And the way we're going to walk through this, like I had mentioned before, is we say, okay, where are we starting? We're at negative 200. Now, if we earn 150 points, we don't make it back to zero. We're still in the negatives. We're still negative 50 points. And then we lose another 100 points. So that leaves us with a score of 150. For Team Extreme, they started off with 450 points, and they lost 300. If you remember from the game board, there weren't 300-point questions. We have to assume this is a combination of questions. But they started with 450, and they lost 300. Therefore, they're at a positive 150 points. They're still ahead of zero. So here we have some other number sentences that we have to figure out. Now, the Excels, they have 350 points, but they lose 450 points total. They get several questions wrong. So Excels had 300 points until they lost 400 points. Now they have 150 points. They have negative 150 points, so they're in the hole. They're below zero at this point. They lost more points than they had, so now they're in the negatives. So they're not doing well, all right? Amazing MS, not sure what that stands for, but here we go. So we're going to fill in the blank here. So So we have to imagine this team is negative 350 points, and then something happens, and they end up at negative 150 points. Well, that something means they had to have earned points. All right, and we just have to figure out how many points they needed to earn. So one way would be to to draw it out. So they're at negative. Is that a straight line? I think it is. No, that's fine. So they're at negative, and sorry for the handwriting. It's difficult to do this with a mouse. So they're at negative 350 points. And then how are they going to end up at negative 150 points? And we know that if they went further, they would have to get 0 points, which is, I'm not sure if my marker's, yep, it's going to let me do it out here. So here's 0 points here. And, sorry about that. It's not a very straight line. So we have to figure out how far do they have to jump forward to get from negative 350 to negative 150, right? And then hopefully ultimately past 0. So if they earned 100 points, that would take them to 250, right? That would get them closer. And if they earned another 100 points, that would take them over to 150. So this must be a positive 200 point score. So however your student figures that out at this point is going to be perfect. Again, this is just an introduction to the concept. So in that case, they started off at negative 350 points and got a 200 point question correct. So here, Sam forgot to record a score and he wrote this number sentence. What score goes in the box? Well, if the team was at negative 350 points and they ended up further below 0 with more negative points, then we had to have added some negative points, right? We would have had to, we added, we added an incorrect answer. So we ended up more negative. So that's this plus sign. We're going to end up more. And the number here has to be negative. So we've lost 100 points. All right. This is a different way of representing minus 100. All right. We're going to add a negative value to 350 and we end up more negative. All right. So that's the missing value there with a little explanation. It didn't ask for an explanation, so just writing in negative 100 would be fine. So we need 3 different pairs of numbers that have a sum of negative 150. So this means we're adding, because it has a sum, we need 3 different pairs. So there have to be pairs of numbers. We don't get a larger sequence than 2. So here is one possible answer to that question. So let me go ahead and cut and paste this. Oops, I don't need bullets. Your student could have come up with a different answer, that's fine. Different answers. They want to use these answers, that's fine too, as long as they understand what's going on. So we're going to add 100 points and negative 250 points. So let's say the team started out 100 above 0 and they answered a 250 point question wrong. So when you put this point value and this point value together, that's addition, you end up with negative 150 points. All right. So if we did the same thing with 2 incorrect answers, so I got a 50 point question wrong and then, that's addition. And then I got a 100 point question wrong. That would also put me at negative 150. Finally, if I had 50 points and I got a 200 point question wrong, that would also put me at negative 150 points. So here are some pairs that work. Does the order of add-ins are the 2 values that we're adding together, matter? Explain your reasoning. So in this case, no. Well, if your students go back to a lesson on properties of operations, they would know that addition has the commutative property, which means you can change the order of things. Now, what becomes important is that when we're adding numbers, that we're using a negative sign to represent incorrect answers, because it wouldn't matter at that point. If in my first case here, I got a 250 point question wrong first, and then I got a 100 points question correct, I would still end up at negative 150. So same thing here on the last one. If I answered a 200-point question incorrectly first and then I earned a positive 50 points, I would get the same answer as if I answered a 50-point question correct and then got the 200-point question wrong. So here, order doesn't matter. We end up in the same position. Okay, so as long as we're adding and the negative moves with the number. So the 200-point question has to be incorrect, whether it's first or second. The 50-point question has to be correct or positive, whether it came first or second. And then we can add those together and we'll get the same answer. That's going to be a really important lesson that we're going to hit a lot for this unit. So order doesn't matter as long as the sign travels with the number. So if it was positive in first, it has to be positive when it's second. So finally, we're introduced to two students' methods for adding a couple values together. And this is the last question in the problem. So great job getting to this point. So here, we can see that both answers are correct. So in this case, I would describe Luisa's method as starting off with 300 points and losing 400 points. So if I had 300 points and then I lost 400, I would end up at a negative 100 points, 100 points. Sam's method I would describe a little bit differently. I would say I got two questions, or I answered two questions, and the first one was correct, and the second one was incorrect. So I had to add a negative 400 points to my 300 points, which brings me down. I added an incorrect answer to my total. So here I'm adding something that is incorrect, or I'm adding something that's in the negative direction. So it's pulling my score down. So Sam's method, we take 300 points, add a negative 400, and we still end up at negative 100. Now, explain your reasoning as to why a certain method might work with other pair of scores and maybe the other one does not. Here, Luisa's method works only if we're losing points. So here, if we're using subtraction, that means that no matter what number this is, well, technically we're going to find out later. We could, let's say they got a question wrong and then we had to invalidate it. That would be subtracting away a negative number, but we're going to get to that later. Right now, our students' understanding is that if we're going to subtract a number, that means we're losing points. So Luisa's method here appears to only work when we're losing points. However, Sam's method, because we're combining point values, this will work if this is a negative point value, so we're losing points, or if this was a positive point value where we're gaining points. So when we're adding, we get to choose whether we're adding a positive number or a negative number. At least in our current understanding, we can't do that with subtraction. We're going to learn that we can later. But for now, subtracting a positive number for Luisa means that we're losing points somehow. We have to be losing points. So between the two, I'm going to go with Sam's method because it's more flexible. I get to put the number here that represents either earning or losing points. So that's going to be that's the end of our first lesson. Now, most of the lessons are going to be this long, so thank you for your patience. However, students are going to be given at least a week to go ahead and get these lessons done. And I'm going to try to provide a video on the front end instead of on the back end so that students can have access to it before they get started. So again, thank you for working with me as I try to make up for 4.5 weeks worth of instruction before I came on board at James Monroe. So have a great day. And again, thank you for watching.